Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, a time when conspiracy theories weren't shared on Reddit, but whispered in taverns by people who genuinely believed their neighbor might be a witch. And here's the thing about medieval conspiracy theories. Sometimes they were absolutely horrifyingly correct. So dim your lights, get comfortable, and let's wander through some of history's strangest moments when the paranoid ravings actually turned out to be true. Because nothing says sweet dreams quite like realizing that yes, those monks really were forging documents, and yes, that king absolutely did murder those children. Let's start with something appropriately grim. The Princes in the Tower. You've probably heard this one. Two young boys, Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, disappeared in 1483. They were heirs to the English throne, which never a safe position to be in, historically speaking. Their uncle, Richard III, was supposed to be protecting them. Instead, the boys vanished from the Tower of London, and Richard conveniently became king. For centuries, people whispered that Richard had them killed. Tudor propaganda painted him as a monster. Shakespeare really leaned into the hunchback villain thing, which was a bit much. And for a long time, modern historians said, well, we can't be sure. Maybe they died of natural causes. Maybe they ran away to become medieval influencers. Then, in 1674, workmen demolishing a staircase in the tower found a wooden box. Inside were two small skeletons. The bones were of children, roughly the right ages. They'd been buried under 10 feet of rubble because of course they had. The skeletons showed no obvious signs of violence, but then again, smothering doesn't leave marks on bones. Charles II, who was king at the time of the discovery, decided these were definitely the princes and had them reburied in Westminster Abbey in a lovely urn designed by Christopher Wren. Very classy. In 1933, the bones were examined again. The conclusion: probably two children, probably the right age range, probably boys. The examination wasn't exactly thorough by modern standards, and requests to do DNA testing have been refused by the church, which is a choice. So while we can't be completely certain, the conspiracy theory that Richard III had his nephews murdered and hidden in a wall has gone from wild Tudor propaganda to probably what happened. Sweet dreams. Let's drift over to France now, because French medieval conspiracies have a certain je ne sais quoi, usually involving poison. The affair of the poisons sounds like a murder mystery novel, but it was very, very real, and it rocked the French court in the 1670s. Technically, that's early modern rather than medieval, but we're already here, so let's continue. For years, there were rumors that members of the French nobility were visiting fortune tellers who were also, how do I put this delicately, murder consultants. These weren't your friendly neighborhood tarot readers. These were women who would sell you arsenic, help you slip it into your husband's wine, and then tell your fortune while he was dying. Very full service. The whole thing centered around a woman named Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisin, who ran what was essentially a murder-for-hire business disguised as a fortune-telling salon. King Louis XIV's police investigated, because even absolute monarchs get nervous when half the court is allegedly poisoning the other half. What they found was absolutely wild. Black masses being performed, babies allegedly sacrificed, love potions that were definitely just poison. And the client list included some of the highest-ranking nobles in France. Several members of Louis XIV's own court were implicated. The king's mistress, Madame de Montespan, was rumored to have participated in black masses to keep the king's affections. Whether that was true or just court gossip designed to destroy her remains unclear. But the investigation did reveal that yes, there was absolutely a network of poisoners operating in Paris, and yes, They were being hired by aristocrats to murder inconvenient relatives. Lavoisin was burned at the stake in 1680. 36 people were executed in total. Many more were exiled or imprisoned. Louis XIV eventually shut down the investigation because it was getting too close to people he couldn't afford to accuse. He had the entire archive of the investigation locked away, where it remained sealed for over a century. So the conspiracy theory that French nobles were hiring witches to poison each other? Completely true. The establishment covered it up because acknowledging it fully would have been too embarrassing. Some things never change. Now, let's talk about the Knights Templar, because no discussion of medieval conspiracy theories is complete without warrior monks.
The Templars were founded around 1119 to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Noble cause. They became incredibly wealthy. They essentially invented international banking and, incredibly powerful. They answered only to the Pope, owned castles across Europe and the Middle East, and were, by all accounts, quite good at the whole warrior-monk thing. Then, in 1307, King Philip IV of France had every Templar in France arrested on the same day. The charges: heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, and various other acts that sounded like they came from the medieval equivalent of a tabloid. The confessions were obtained through torture, which, not exactly reliable. Many historians assumed the charges were completely fabricated, that Philip just wanted to seize the Templars' wealth because he was deeply in debt to them, which he absolutely did want to do. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of the charges, particularly about secret initiation ceremonies, appear to have been at least partially true. Not the demon worship and spitting on crosses; those were almost certainly fabricated. But the Templars did have secret rituals that they kept hidden from the church and from outsiders. They had their own internal hierarchy and their own way of doing things. Modern analysis of Templar documents and archaeology has revealed that yes, they had esoteric practices that would have looked suspicious to medieval authorities. They were conducting financial operations that resembled banking, charging interest in ways that technically violated church law against usury. They had become, essentially, a state within a state, with their own rules. So while the specific accusations were exaggerated and distorted through torture and political maneuvering, the underlying conspiracy theory that the Templars were operating in secret, following their own agenda, and violating some church regulations, had kernels of truth. Philip IV exploited genuine concerns and legitimate oddities, wrapped them in horror story accusations, and used them to destroy an entire order. The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314. According to legend, he cursed both King Philip and Pope Clement V from the flames, saying they would join him before God within a year. Both men were dead within 8 months, which honestly is the kind of timing that makes you wonder. Let's meander over to Italy now, to talk about the Borgias, because when people in Renaissance Rome said that family is terrifyingly corrupt and probably poisoning everyone, they were not exaggerating even slightly. The Borgias were a Spanish family who rose to power in Italy in the late 1400s. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, which, look, papal elections have always been political, but this one was especially shameless. He basically bought the papacy. He wasn't even pretending to be celibate. He had at least 7 acknowledged children, possibly more. For years, people whispered that the Borgias were poisoning their enemies, that they had a special poison called la Cantarella that they used to eliminate rivals and confiscate their estates, that they were running the papacy like a crime family. And the thing is, they absolutely were. Rodrigo's son, Cesare Borgia, was even worse. He murdered his sister's husband. He possibly murdered his own brother. He definitely murdered numerous rivals and enemies throughout his career as a military commander and papal enforcer. Machiavelli literally based the prince on Caesar, which tells you something about his reputation. The accusations of poisoning were so widespread that when Pope Alexander VI himself died suddenly in 1503, everyone assumed he'd been poisoned. The conspiracy theories ranged from he accidentally drank wine he depoisoned for someone else to rival cardinals finally got him. Modern analysis suggests he probably died of malaria, which was rampant in Rome that summer, but given the family's track record, you can understand why people were suspicious. The Borgias absolutely used poison as a political tool. They absolutely used the papacy to enrich themselves and eliminate enemies. They absolutely operated like a criminal organization with a Papal seal. The conspiracy theories about them were unparanoid fantasies. They were accurate assessments that people were too afraid to say loudly while the Borgias were still in power. After Alexander VI's death, the family's power collapsed almost immediately, which tells you how much it depended on having a Borgia pope. Cesare died in 1507 in a minor skirmish in Spain, which seems like an anticlimactic end for someone who'd terrorized Italy for years. But there you go. Lucretia Borgia, Caesar's sister, lived until 1519 and by all accounts became a decent patron of the arts in Ferrara, though her reputation never quite recovered from her family's legacy. Whether she was complicit in her family's crimes or just a pawn used in their schemes remains debated. But either way, growing up as a Borgia could not have been relaxing. Now let's drift north, to England, for a conspiracy theory that sounds completely bonkers until you realize it's documented fact. In the 1320s, England was ruled by Edward II, who was not great at being king. He had a habit of elevating favorites to positions of power and wealth, which annoyed the nobility to no end. His relationship with Piers Gaveston was so intense and so controversial that the barons eventually captured and executed Gaveston, which did not improve Edward's mood or his popularity. Later, Edward became similarly close with Hugh Despenser the Younger, and the two of them basically ran England together, seizing lands and wealth from anyone who opposed them. This went over about as well as you'd expect. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, was increasingly sidelined and disrespected. She was called the she-wolf of France by later writers, which sounds dramatic but honestly seems fair given what happened next. In 1325, Isabella went to France on a diplomatic mission and just didn't come back. She started an affair with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron, and together they began plotting to invade England and depose Edward, which sounds like a conspiracy theory, except they openly did this. They raised an army, invaded in 1326, and Edward's support collapsed immediately. Edward II was captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son Edward III, and imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. Then, in September 1327, he died. The official story was that he died of natural causes. Everyone knew this was nonsense. The rumors that circulated were that he'd been murdered, and the method described was so horrific that people assumed it had to be exaggeration or propaganda. The story was that he'd been held down and killed with a red-hot poker inserted. Well, let us just say in a way designed to leave no external marks while being as agonizing as possible. It was seen as symbolic punishment for his suspected relationships with men. For centuries, historians debated whether this really happened or whether it was just propaganda by Edward's supporters to make Isabella and Mortimer look monstrous. Then historians started examining the contemporary sources more carefully. The accounts are consistent. The method described appears in multiple independent sources, and the political logic needing Edward dead but without obvious signs of murder makes horrible sense. Modern consensus is that yes, Edward II was almost certainly murdered, and yes, it was probably roughly as horrible as the stories suggest. The conspiracy theory was true. Isabella and Mortimer ruled England for 3 years through the young Edward III until he turned 18. Arrested Mortimer, had him executed, and sent his mother into comfortable retirement. Isabella lived until 1358, dying in her early 60s, and was buried in her wedding dress, clutching Edward II's heart in a silver casket, which is a choice that raises more questions than it answers. Let's drift eastward now, to talk about medieval secret societies, because they absolutely existed, and they absolutely influenced politics in ways that would make modern conspiracy theorists feel validated. The assassins, the Nizari Ismailis, were a Shia Islamic sect operating primarily from mountain fortresses in Persia and Syria during the 12th and 13th centuries. Their name comes from Hashishan, which may refer to hashish, though whether they actually used it is debated. What's not debated is that they pioneered political assassination as a tool of statecraft. For decades, Crusaders and Muslim rulers alike whispered about this secret organization that could infiltrate anywhere, that had members willing to die to kill designated targets, that operated from impregnable mountain fortresses. It sounded like fantasy. It was entirely real. The assassins were led by a series of leaders called the Old Man of the Mountain, and they maintained power through a combination of genuine religious devotion, strategic assassinations, and a reputation so fearsome that the mere threat of their attention could influence policy. They killed caliphs, viziers, crusader lords, and anyone else their leadership designated as a target. Their most famous fortress was Alamut in northern Iran, built on a mountain peak that was considered unconquerable. They held it for over 150 years. The Mongols finally took it in 1256. And the Mongol leader, Hulagu Khan, had the extensive library at Alamut burned, which, thanks for that, really. Who knows what historical records were lost? Marco Polo wrote about the assassins, and his account was dismissed as fanciful exaggeration for centuries. He claimed they had a secret garden paradise where initiates were drugged and shown glimpses of heaven to motivate them to die for the cause. This was assumed to be complete fabrication until modern historians realized that Crusader sources and Muslim sources also described something similar. Whether it was exactly as Polo described, we'll never know, but the assassins definitely had elaborate initiation ceremonies and did cultivate devoted followers willing to die on missions. The conspiracy theory that a secret Islamic cult was conducting political assassinations throughout the medieval Middle East was not a theory, it was fact. They were so effective that the word assassin entered European languages specifically because of them. Let us stay with the theme of things that sound made up but are on and talk about the cadaver synod, which is possibly the most medieval thing that ever prevailed. In 897, Pope Stephen VI put his predecessor, Pope Formosus, on trial. This would be unusual but not entirely unprecedented. Popes had criticized previous popes before. The problem was that Formosus had been dead for about 9 months. Stephen VI had Formosus's corpse exhumed, dressed in papal vestments, and propped up in a chair in the papal court. A deacon was appointed to answer for the corpse, who was charged with various ecclesiastical crimes, including perjury, serving as a bishop when he'd been excommunicated, and generally having been pope when Stephen's supporters felt he shouldn't have been. The corpse was found guilty. Obviously, it's hard to mount an effective defense when you're decomposing. Formosus's papal election was declared invalid. All his acts as pope were annulled, and his corpse was stripped of its vestments, had the 3 fingers used in papal blessings cut off, and was dumped in the Tiber River. For years, this was assumed to be anti-papal propaganda, the kind of horror story Protestants would later tell about how corrupt the medieval papacy was. Except it's extremely well documented in multiple contemporary sources. It absolutely happened. The papacy really was that dysfunctional in the late 9th century. The aftermath was appropriately chaotic. A monk allegedly rescued Formosus's body from the Tiber and secretly reburied it. Later, after Stephen VI was himself deposed and strangled to death in prison, because that's how papal politics worked in this period, Formosus was retried, found innocent, and reburied in St. Peter's Basilica with full honors. Then a later pope annulled that decision and found Formosus guilty again. Then another pope reversed that. Formosus was dug up and reburied at least 3 times total. The poor man could not catch a break, even in death. The conspiracy theory that the medieval papacy was corrupt, violent, and occasionally completely insane, demonstrated beautifully by the time they put a corpse on trial. Let's drift over to talk about medical conspiracies now, because medieval people absolutely believed their doctors were poisoning them. and sometimes they were completely right to be suspicious. Bloodletting was the standard treatment for basically everything in medieval medicine. Fever, bleed you. Headache, bleed you. Plague, definitely bleed you. The theory was that the body had 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They needed to be balanced. Since doctors couldn't see phlegm or bile sloshing around, they focused on blood, which was convenient because you could definitely remove that. The thing is, bloodletting could kill you, obviously. Removing significant amounts of blood from someone who's already sick is not helpful. Medieval people noticed this. They noticed that sometimes people died after being treated by doctors. They suspected that doctors were either incompetent or actively harmful. They were largely correct. The conspiracy wasn't that doctors were maliciously trying to kill people. Most medieval physicians genuinely believed in humoral theory and thought they were helping, but the effect was the same. Medical treatment actively worsened outcomes in many cases. Patients who avoided doctors often did better than those who sought treatment, which is not ideal for a profession. Then there were actual cases of medical murder. Doctors had access to poisons. They understood how bodies worked better than most people. If you wanted to kill someone and make it look natural, being a physician was an excellent cover. In 1531, the Bishop of Rochester's cook, Richard Roos, was accused of poisoning a pot of porridge, killing 2 people, and making several others ill. He was boiled alive for it. Henry VIII introduced a special law making poisoning treason, punishable by boiling, specifically because of this case. But the incident fed into existing fears that anyone with access to food or medicine could be a poisoner. There were periodic accusations throughout the medieval period that physicians were experimenting on patients, testing new treatments without consent, or using medical knowledge for nefarious purposes. And while most medieval doctors were probably doing their best, within a deeply flawed framework of understanding, some of these accusations were true. Arnaud de Villanova, a 13th century physician and alchemist, was repeatedly accused of practicing black magic and poisoning. Some charges were probably false, but he definitely was experimenting with substances and techniques that were considered dangerous and heretical. He was protected by powerful patrons, including King James II of Aragon, which saved him from serious consequences. The conspiracy theory that doctors might kill you was not paranoia. It was a reasonable assessment of medieval medicine. Now let's talk about forged documents, because the medieval period was absolutely rife with forgery, and some of the forgeries shaped European history for centuries. The donation of Constantine was supposedly a decree by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, giving Pope Sylvester I authority over Rome, Italy, and the entire Western Roman Empire, while Constantine moved to Constantinople. This document was the basis for papal claims to temporal power throughout the Middle Ages. Popes cited it constantly. It was legal justification for the papal states. It was completely fake. For centuries, people suspected it was forged. It made Constantine sound weirdly obsessed with papal authority in ways that didn't fit with 4th century Christianity. The Latin was wrong for the period, but questioning it too loudly was dangerous, because it was the foundation of papal political power. In 1440, an Italian humanist named Lorenzo Valla proved definitively that it was a forgery, probably created in the 8th century. He analyzed the language, the historical anachronisms, the legal terminology that didn't exist in Constantine's time. His proof was devastating and completely correct. The Church did not take this well. Valla's work was suppressed and he was nearly charged with heresy. But the information slowly spread, and by the Protestant Reformation, the forged donation was being used as evidence of Catholic corruption. The conspiracy theory that the papacy's temporal power was based on a forged document, absolutely true. And the donation of Constantine wasn't even the only major medieval forgery. The Pseudo-Isidorian decretals were a collection of supposedly ancient church laws that were actually fabricated in 9th century France. They were cited as authoritative for centuries before being exposed as fake. Monasteries forged land charters constantly, creating documents that proved they'd been granted estates centuries earlier. Royal genealogies were forged to create more impressive lineages. Saints' lives were embellished or invented wholesale. The medieval period was absolutely swimming in forged documents, and the people who suspected this were correct. Let's drift now to talk about royal murders, because medieval people constantly whispered that their kings were being poisoned or assassinated. And honestly, they were right more often than not. King John of England died in 1216, supposedly from dysentery after eating peaches and drinking ale. That was the official story. The unofficial story, whispered in every corner of England, was that he'd been poisoned by a monk at Swineshead Abbey. The monk had allegedly been outraged by John's treatment of the church and had been excommunicated for years and decided to take matters into his own hands by poisoning the king's food. For centuries, this was dismissed as propaganda. John was deeply unpopular, having lost most of England's French territories, quarreled with the Pope, and been forced to sign the Magna Carta. Of course, his enemies would spread stories that he'd been murdered. Dysentery was common. People died from it all the time. But modern analysis of the chronicles and medical evidence suggests the monk's story might actually be true, or at least partially true. John's symptoms progressed unusually rapidly. He was fine, then violently ill, then dead within days. The timeline is consistent with poisoning. Multiple independent chroniclers mention the monk's story, which suggests it wasn't just one person's invention. We'll never know for certain, but the conspiracy theory that King John was poisoned by a monk has gone from obvious fabrication to quite possibly what happened. Edward II's murder we've already covered, but let's talk about his great-grandfather, King John's father, Henry II, and the murder that definitely happened, and that Henry definitely ordered, even though he spent years claiming it was all a terrible misunderstanding. Thomas Becket was Archbishop of Canterbury and Henry II's former friend. They'd had a falling out over church authority versus royal authority, the kind of argument that got very intense in medieval politics. In December 1170, Henry, in a fit of rage, allegedly shouted something along the lines of, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took this as an order. They travelled to Canterbury, confronted Becket in the cathedral, and murdered him. They split his skull open on the cathedral floor. It was brutal, public, and absolutely a political assassination. Henry II spent the rest of his life claiming he hadn't meant for this to happen, that it was all a tragic misunderstanding, that those knights had acted on their own. This was obvious nonsense. Everyone knew Henry had wanted Becket dead. The knights were never seriously punished. Henry did public penancy, walked to Canterbury barefoot, and had monks whip him, which was quite the performance, but he kept all his power, and the knights kept their lands. The conspiracy theory that Henry II had Becket murdered was not a theory. It was a fact that everyone knew, including Henry, who just pretended otherwise because admitting it would have been politically inconvenient. Becket was made a saint almost immediately because the medieval church loved nothing more than a martyr who'd been murdered by a king. His shrine at Canterbury became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Europe. Henry VIII would later destroy it during the Reformation, because the Tudors had a thing about destroying popular religious sites, but for centuries it was immensely powerful and profitable. Let's meander over to France now, to talk about Joan of Arc, because the conspiracy theories about her trial and execution were absolutely correct. Joan was captured by the Burgundians in 1430 and sold to the English, who were still fighting the 100 Years' War against France. She'd been instrumental in French victories and had helped get Charles VII crowned, so the English were extremely motivated to discredit her. They put her on trial for heresy. The trial was a farce. Everyone knew it was a farce. Joan was 19 years old, illiterate, and facing a panel of learned theologians who were being paid by the English. The charges kept changing. The questioning was designed to trap her. When she gave clever answers, and she did, remarkably often they just changed the charges or rephrased the questions. She was convicted of heresy primarily for wearing men's clothing, which, look, the theological justification was complicated, but basically they needed a charge that would stick, and that was the best they could do. She was burned at stake in 1431 in Rouen. For years, French supporters claimed the trial was illegitimate, politically motivated, and that Joan was innocent. English supporters claimed it was a proper heresy trial, and she'd been justly convicted. This wasn't really a conspiracy theory, because everyone knew the English had engineered the trial. But the question was whether it had any legal or theological validity whatsoever. In 1456, the Pope authorized a retrial. The Church examined all the evidence and concluded that yes, the original trial had been completely illegitimate. Joan was declared innocent. Every single procedural rule had been violated. The judges had been biased. The charges had been trumped up. It was a show trial from beginning to end. Joan was eventually canonized as a saint in 1920, which seems like closing the barn door several centuries after the horse had left, but there you go. The conspiracy theory that Joan of Arc's trial was a politically motivated execution, dressed up as theology, was completely true, and even the Church eventually admitted it. Now let's talk about the Black Death, because the conspiracy theories that emerged during the plague years were wild, sometimes based in truth, and led to horrific violence. The plague hit Europe in 1347 and killed somewhere between a third and half of the population over the next few years. People were terrified and desperate for explanations. The official explanation that it was God's punishment for sin didn't satisfy everyone, partly because it didn't explain why the plague killed indiscriminately, including babies and priests. So people looked for human agents. The most common conspiracy theory was that Jews were poisoning wells. This accusation spread across Europe rapidly. Jewish communities were accused of creating poison from spiders, frogs, and Christian blood, then dumping it in wells to kill Christians. This was complete nonsense. Jews were dying from plague at the same rates as Christians. The plague was spread by fleas on rats, not by well water. The accusations made no logical sense, but they spread anyway, and they led to massacres. In 1349, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in Strasbourg. The entire Jewish community of Basel was burned. Pogroms spread across the Holy Roman Empire. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull pointing out that Jews were dying from plague too, and ordering Christians to stop murdering them, which helped somewhat but didn't end the violence. So this is a conspiracy theory that was completely false, but was widely believed, and had devastating real-world consequences. But here's where it gets complicated. There were actual cases of well poisoning during the plague years, just not by Jews. In 1348, a man in Savoy confessed under torture to being part of a plot to poison wells. His confession implicated others. More arrests followed, more confessions under torture. Some of those arrested were Jewish, but many weren't. The whole thing spiraled into panic and violence. Modern historians believe that most or all of these confessions were false, extracted through torture, and that there probably wasn't any organized well poisoning plot. But the fear was real, and the accusations had enough surface plausibility. People were dying mysteriously. Wells were a communal resource that could be tampered with, that the conspiracy theory spread. There were also cases of people deliberately spreading disease during plague outbreaks, though whether this was malicious or just people not understanding contagion is unclear. Plague spreaders were accused and sometimes executed in various Italian cities. Some may have been scapegoats. Some may have been mentally ill people who genuinely believed they were spreading plague. Some may have been criminals taking advantage of chaos. The conspiracy theory about plague poisoners was mostly false, but fed on real fears and some kernel of real incidents, distorted beyond recognition. Let's talk about Richard III again, but this time about a different conspiracy theory that turned out to be true. For centuries after his death, Richard III was portrayed as a hunchbacked villain, a monster who murdered his way to the throne. Shakespeare's play fixed this image in popular culture. But starting in the 20th century, some historians began arguing that this was all Tudor propaganda, that Richard was actually a reasonably competent king who'd been unfairly maligned by the dynasty that overthrew him. The Ricardians, as his defenders were called, claimed that the physical deformities attributed to Richard were inventions, that he was described as hunchbacked and withered only after his death, by Tudor writers who wanted to make him look evil, that the real Richard would have been a normal-looking man. Then, in 2012, archaeologists found Richard III's skeleton under a parking lot in Leicester, and it turned out he absolutely did have severe scoliosis. His spine was curved dramatically. One shoulder would have been higher than the other. He would have looked visibly asymmetric. So the Tudor writers who described him as physically deformed were actually correct about that part. They may have exaggerated Shakespeare's portrayal as definitely over the top, but the basic fact of Richard having a spinal deformity was true, not invented propaganda. This doesn't tell us whether Richard murdered his nephews or not. It doesn't tell us whether he was a good or bad king, but it does confirm that the contemporary descriptions of his appearance, which Ricardians had dismissed as slander, were based on observable reality. The conspiracy theory that Richard III was physically deformed was not a conspiracy theory. It was an accurate description that later got dismissed as propaganda until the skeleton proved otherwise. Let's drift to Spain now to talk about the Spanish Inquisition, because the reputation it has is actually somewhat deserved, despite what some revisionist historians have tried to argue. For years, Protestant propaganda portrayed the Spanish Inquisition as an engine of terror, torturing and burning thousands of innocents. This was seen as exaggeration and anti-Catholic bias. Modern historians pointed out that the Inquisition kept detailed records, and according to those records, they executed far fewer people than Protestant propaganda claimed. The torture was regulated and not as extreme as described. The trials had procedures and rules. All of this is technically true. The Spanish Inquisition was more bureaucratic and less randomly violent than its reputation suggested. But that's a very low bar. The Inquisition absolutely did torture people. They used the rack, water torture, and other techniques to extract confessions. They absolutely did burn people at stake. The auto da fe ceremonies were public executions designed to instill fear. They absolutely did target conversos Jews who deconverted to Christianity based on paranoid suspicions that they were secretly still practicing Judaism. The conspiracy theory that the Spanish Inquisition was hunting secret Jews was not paranoid fantasy. That was literally their primary function. Some of the people they accused genuinely were practicing Judaism in secret because they'd been forced to convert on pain of death and expulsion. Others were completely innocent, but were denounced by rivals or neighbors with grudges. The Inquisition created an atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion where anyone could be denounced, where having Jewish ancestry made you permanently suspect, where your religious sincerity could always be questioned. This was not Protestant exaggeration. This was documented policy. Modern attempts to rehabilitate the Spanish Inquisition's reputation by saying, well, they did kill as many people as their enemies claimed, is technically accurate but misses the point. They were still a tool of religious persecution and state terror. The conspiracy theories about them were largely true. Let's stay in monasteries for a while, because medieval monks were up to all sorts of schemes that they absolutely did not want the outside world knowing about. Monasteries were supposed to be places of prayer, contemplation, and holy poverty. In reality, many were incredibly wealthy institutions engaged in economic competition, political maneuvering, and occasional outright fraud. When medieval people suspected that monks were more concerned with money than salvation, they were often correct. Take the matter of relics. Medieval Christianity was obsessed with relics, physical remains of saints or objects associated with them. A good relic could attract pilgrims, and pilgrims brought donations. Monasteries competed fiercely to acquire relics, and where acquisition wasn't possible, creation would do. The number of splinters from the true cross circulating in medieval Europe could have built several crosses. Multiple monasteries claimed to have the head of John the Baptist, which was either a miracle of duplication or evidence of fraud. Saints' bones were allegedly multiplying faster than the saints had reproduced during their lifetimes. When skeptics accused monasteries of forging relics, church authorities called this blasphemy and impiety. But the skeptics were absolutely correct. Archaeological and scientific analysis has confirmed that many famous medieval relics were fabrications. created to attract pilgrims and wealth. The monastery of Conques in France had the relics of Saint Foy, which were allegedly stolen from another monastery by a monk who infiltrated the rival institution for 10 years just to steal the bones. This story was told proudly, was considered holy theft, done for a righteous cause, which tells you something about monastic ethics regarding relics. When people accused monks of being thieves, the monks sometimes were literally advertising that they'd stolen relics and were proud of it. Let's talk about monastic finances, because this gets into conspiracy theories about the church hoarding wealth that were absolutely true. Monasteries in the late medieval period owned enormous amounts of land. They were some of the largest landowners in Europe. They collected rents, tithes, and donations. They operated mills, fisheries, and other businesses. They loaned money. They were essentially major economic institutions. The rule of Saint Benedict, which many monasteries supposedly followed, emphasized poverty and manual labor. The reality in most wealthy monasteries was that monks lived quite comfortably, ate well, and spent very little time doing actual manual labor. Peasants and servants did the work. The monks managed the estate. When critics, particularly in the period leading up to the Reformation, accused monasteries of living in luxury while preaching poverty, church authorities denied this vehemently. But account books and archaeological evidence confirm that elite monasteries absolutely lived well. They had fine food, good wine, comfortable accommodations, and extensive libraries. The conspiracy theory that the church was rich and hypocritical was true. This doesn't mean every monk was corrupt. Many genuinely tried to live according to their vows, but the institution as a whole had strayed very far from its stated ideals. Now, let's talk about manuscript forgery, because this was rampant and shaped what we think we know about the ancient and early medieval world. Monasteries were the libraries of medieval Europe. They copied ancient texts, preserving classical learning. This was valuable work. It's also why monks had the perfect opportunity to alter, embellish, or completely fabricate texts. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote the history of the kings of Britain in the 1130s, claiming it was based on ancient sources. It's where most Arthurian legend comes from. Geoffrey claimed he was translating from a certain very ancient book written in the British language. This book has never been found, probably because it never existed. Geoffrey made up enormous chunks of British history, invented kings, created dramatic stories, and passed it all off as authentic ancient history. For centuries, his work was cited as authoritative. We now know it's largely fiction, with some historical names scattered through it. When skeptics accused Geoffrey of fabricating his sources, they were absolutely right, but proving it took centuries. This pattern repeated constantly. Monks would claim to have ancient sources that supported whatever point they wanted to make, whether it was land claims, ecclesiastical privileges, or historical narratives. Sometimes these sources existed but were misrepresented. Often they were fabricated entirely. The Constitutum Constantini, the donation of Constantine we discussed earlier, was almost certainly created in a monastery, probably at the Papal court, by someone with enough learning to create a plausible-looking document, but not quite enough to avoid anachronisms that would later expose it as fake. Conspiracy theories about monks forging documents were true so often that it's safer to assume forgery and then be pleasantly surprised by authenticity. Let's drift to talk about medical knowledge that was being suppressed by the church, because this is a conspiracy theory that's partially true in complicated ways. The medieval church didn't exactly suppress medical knowledge, but it did restrict who could access it and what could be publicly discussed. Anatomy was taught in universities, but human dissection was controversial and often forbidden or heavily restricted. Doctors learned from ancient texts and animal dissection, which meant their understanding of human anatomy was often just wrong. When critics accused the church of preventing the advancement of medical knowledge, church authorities pointed to the universities they funded, the hospitals they ran, the medical care they provided. All of this was true. The church absolutely supported medicine, but they also restricted inquiry that contradicted theological positions. The church opposed contraception and abortion, which meant medical knowledge about reproductive control was suppressed or pushed underground. Texts on these subjects existed, many from Arabic sources, but were not widely taught or distributed in Christian Europe. Knowledge about the female reproductive system was particularly suppressed. Male doctors wrote confidently about female anatomy, despite never having been allowed to examine it properly. And women who actually understood these matters were often suspected of witchcraft if they shared their knowledge too freely. So the conspiracy theory that the church suppressed medical knowledge is partially true. They didn't oppose all medical learning, but they absolutely restricted areas that contradicted doctrine or threatened social control. Now, let's talk about what was really going on in convents, because the whispered rumors were often more accurate than the official denials. Convents were supposed to be places where women devoted their lives to God in prayer and celibacy. In reality, convents were often where families put inconvenient daughters, women who didn't want to marry, women with disabilities, younger daughters for whom dowries couldn't be afforded, and women who'd been compromised in some way. Life in convents varied enormously. Some were strict and austere. Others were relatively comfortable for women from wealthy families, who might have private rooms, servants, and considerable freedom within the convent walls. Some convents were essentially retirement communities for aristocratic women. And then there were the scandals. In 1489, the convent of Santa Polonia in Florence was investigated for having become, essentially, a brothel. Nuns were entertaining men in their cells. Parties were being held. The abbess was allegedly running the whole operation. When investigators showed up, they found evidence that confirmed every scandalous rumor. The Bishop of Lincoln's visitation records from the 1440s document widespread problems in English convents, nuns having affairs with priests, children being born in convents, financial mismanagement, and drunkenness. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systemic enough that bishops had to conduct regular inspections. When people whispered that convents weren't really bastions of purity and prayer, they were often correct. Not all convents were corrupt. Many maintained decent standards, but enough had serious problems that the rumors had basis in fact. The Protestant Reformation would later use these scandals as propaganda against monasticism in general. But the scandals were real. The inspections were real. The illegitimate children born in convents were real. Let us talk about simony, the buying and selling of church offices, because this is a conspiracy theory that was actually just standard practice for centuries. Church offices, from parish priests to bishops to the papacy itself, were routinely bought and sold. Families would pay to get their sons appointed as bishops. Kings would sell church positions to raise funds. The papacy would sell offices to finance building projects or wars. This was technically against church law. It was called simony after Simon Magus, who in the Acts of the Apostles tried to buy the power of the Holy Spirit from the apostles. It was condemned regularly in church councils and papal decrees, and it kept happening anyway, because it was incredibly profitable and everyone was doing it. When critics accused the church of selling salvation and church offices for money, church authorities would deny it strenuously while simultaneously having price lists for various positions. The hypocrisy was stunning. The sale of indulgences payments that supposedly reduced time in purgatory was just the most visible form of this. Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517 attacked the sale of indulgences specifically, which helped spark the Protestant Reformation. But the conspiracy theory that the church was corrupt and selling spiritual goods for profit was anti-theory. It was documented fact that anyone paying attention could see. Let's drift back to political conspiracies now, because medieval courts were cesspits of intrigue where paranoia was often justified. The Wars of the Roses, the English civil wars between the houses of York and Lancaster from 1455 to 1487 generated conspiracy theories faster than battles. Everyone suspected everyone else of plotting, and they were usually right. Take George, Duke of Clarence, brother of King Edward IV. George was ambitious, foolish, and kept switching sides in the Civil War. He joined a rebellion against his brother, then was forgiven. He kept making trouble, spreading rumors, accusing people of witchcraft, and generally being a problem. In 1478, Edward IV finally had enough. George was arrested, tried in Parliament, and executed. The official record says he was executed, but doesn't specify how. The persistent rumor was that he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, essentially, a large barrel of sweet wine. This sounds ridiculous. It sounds like exactly the kind of colorful fabrication that would emerge about an unpopular noble's death. For centuries, historians assumed it was myth, but contemporary sources mention it. The wine barrel story appears in multiple independent accounts, and it's actually plausible Malmsey wine was George's favorite drink. So making his execution method a grotesque parody of his tastes fits Edward IV's dark sense of humor. Modern historians have generally concluded that yes, George probably was drowned in wine. As absurd as that sounds, the conspiracy theory was true. Medieval executions could be that bizarre. Let's talk about the princes in the tower one more time, but from a different angle. Everyone focuses on whether Richard III killed them, but there's another conspiracy theory that's less discussed, that one or both princes might have survived. In the 1490s, a young man appeared, claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes. He was supported by several European powers and by some English nobles who claimed to recognize him. He's known to history as Perkin Warbeck. Henry VII, who'd won the throne in 1485, said Warbeck was an impostor, a nobody from Flanders pretending to be a prince. Warbeck insisted he was the real Richard. The conspiracy theory was that maybe he actually was who he claimed to be, that one prince had survived somehow. Henry VII eventually captured Warbeck, kept him confined in comfortable conditions for a while, then had him executed for attempting escape. The official narrative is that Warbeck was definitely an impostor who eventually confessed under pressure. But here's the thing, we don't know for certain. Warbeck's confession may have been coerced. Some of the people who supported him genuinely seemed to believe he was who he claimed. The evidence against him mostly comes from Henry VII's government, which had every reason to claim he was fake. Modern historians generally believe Warbeck was an impostor, but there's enough uncertainty that the conspiracy theory that he might have been real hasn't been completely disproven. It probably never will be. Similarly, Lambert Simnel appeared in 1487 claiming to be the Earl of Warwick, another prince with a claim to the throne. He was also declared an impostor and captured, but Henry VII kept him alive as a servant in the royal household, which was an oddly merciful treatment if he'd been a complete nobody with no legitimate claim. The whole situation suggests that identity in medieval nobility was more fluid and uncertain than we'd like to believe. When multiple people could plausibly claim to be missing princes, and when determining truth was nearly impossible, conspiracy theories flourished. Let's talk about the Pazzi conspiracy in Florence in 1478, because this is a conspiracy that absolutely happened, was extraordinarily dramatic, and resulted in one of the most brutal vengeances in Renaissance history. The Medici family controlled Florence. The Pazzi family, along with some other rivals and supported by Pope Sixtus IV, planned to murder Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici and take over the city. The plan was to kill both brothers during Mass in Florence Cathedral, when they'd be vulnerable, and when the conspirators could claim divine sanction. On April 26, 1478, during High Mass, with the cathedral full of worshippers, the conspirators struck. Giuliano was stabbed multiple times and died. Lorenzo fought off his attackers and escaped, wounded but alive. The conspiracy immediately fell apart. The vengeance was swift and brutal. Lorenzo's supporters caught the conspirators and anyone else suspected of involvement. They were thrown from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio with nooses around their necks to hang from the facade. Others were hunted down and killed. Over 80 people were executed, many without trial. The Archbishop of Pisa, who was involved in the plot, was hanged in his archbishop's robes from the window of the Palazzo Vecchio. When he was dying, he allegedly bit into the body of a fellow conspirator hanging beside him. This detail shows up in multiple sources. which either means it really happened or Renaissance Florentines agreed that this was the kind of detail that made the story better. The Pope excommunicated Florence for hanging an archbishop. Florence basically ignored this. Lorenzo survived and ruled for another 14 years. The Medici consolidated power even further after the conspiracy failed. This wasn't a conspiracy theory, it was an actual conspiracy, documented by numerous witnesses, and its failure led to one of the most vicious political purges of the era. Now, let's drift to talk about ergot poisoning, because this explains several medieval mysteries that people thought were supernatural. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. If consumed, it causes ergotism, also called St. Anthony's fire, which has symptoms ranging from hallucinations to gangrene. Medieval people didn't understand what caused it. They thought it was a divine punishment or demonic possession. For years, historians wondered if ergot's poisoning might explain some medieval phenomena that were attributed to witchcraft or mass hysteria. This was dismissed as speculation. Then toxicologists and historians started examining the evidence more carefully. Outbreaks of dancing mania, or St. Vitus's dance, where groups of people would dance uncontrollably, sometimes until they collapsed, often occurred in areas where ergot contamination was likely. The symptoms match ergot poisoning. The Salem witch trials in 1692, technically early modern, not medieval, but close enough, have been plausibly linked to ergot poisoning. The symptoms the accusers described: convulsions, hallucinations, crawling sensations on the skin match ergot poisoning. Salem was in an area where rye was grown and stored in conditions favorable to ergot. This doesn't explain all accusations of witchcraft or all cases of mass hysteria, but it explains some. The conspiracy theory that some demonic possessions were actually poisoning was correct. Medieval people did occasionally suspect poisoning during these outbreaks, but they assumed malicious human poisoners rather than contaminated grain. They were half right, there was poisoning, just not intentional. Let's talk about whether medieval people knew the earth was round, because this gets into conspiracy theories about the church suppressing knowledge. The modern myth is that medieval people thought the earth was flat, and the church persecuted anyone who said otherwise. This is almost entirely false. Educated medieval people absolutely knew the earth was round. Ancient Greek learning on this topic had been preserved. Scholars taught spherical earth in universities. But this is where it gets complicated. There absolutely were debates about the size of the earth and what existed in the southern hemisphere. Some church authorities argued that there couldn't be inhabited lands in the southern hemisphere, because those people couldn't have descended from Adam and Eve or been reached by Christian missionaries. So while the flat earth myth is false, there were ways in which theological concerns did restrict geographical speculation. The church didn't suppress the knowledge that earth was round, but they did suppress some implications of that roundness that contradicted doctrine. When Columbus proposed sailing west to reach Asia, critics said it wouldn't work, not because they thought the earth was flat, but because they correctly calculated that Asia was too far away and Columbus would run out of supplies. Columbus's calculations were wrong. He got lucky that there was an unknown continent in the way, which is not the victory for scientific thinking that it's sometimes portrayed as. The conspiracy theory that the church suppressed knowledge about Earth's shape is false. The more subtle reality that theological concerns shaped which geographical questions could be freely explored is true. Let's talk about succession crises now, because medieval royal families were absolutely paranoid about rivals and pretenders, and they had good reason to be. The question of who should inherit thrones caused most medieval wars. Primogeniture, eldest son inherits, seems straightforward until you consider, what if the eldest son dies? What if there are only daughters? What if the king's legitimacy is questioned? What if there's a more competent younger brother? What if someone's parents' marriage was annulled, retroactively, making them illegitimate? Every one of these scenarios led to wars, murders, and conspiracies. Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England, was supposed to inherit the throne when her father died in 1135. Henry had made his barons swear to support her succession. Instead, her cousin Stephen rushed to England, claimed the throne, and most barons went along with it because they didn't want a woman ruling. This led to a civil war called the Anarchy that lasted nearly 20 years. Matilda nearly won several times. The country was devastated. Eventually a compromise was reached. Stephen would remain king, but Matilda's son Henry would inherit after Stephen's death. Throughout the war, both sides accused the other of conspiracy, usurpation, and illegitimacy. Stephen's supporters claimed Matilda was unfit to rule. Matilda's supporters claimed Stephen had violated his oath and stolen the throne. Both accusations were true from different perspectives. The conspiracy theory that Stephen had plotted to take the throne. True, he moved quickly when Henry I died, before Matilda could establish herself. The conspiracy theory that the barons had never really intended to let a woman rule. Also true, their oaths turned out to be worthless. Let's drift to Spain for a moment to talk about Pedro the Cruel of Castile, whose nickname tells you a lot about his reputation. Pedro I of Castile ruled from 1350 to 1369. He was called Pedro the Cruel by his enemies, and Pedro the Just by his supporters, which shows how polarizing he was. His reign was full of murders, imprisonments, and executions of rivals and family members. The conspiracy theories about Pedro were that he was a paranoid tyrant murdering anyone who threatened him, possibly including some of his own family members, for purely political reasons. His supporters claimed these were necessary executions of traitors and plotters. Modern historical analysis suggests Pedro probably did order several murders that went beyond justified executions, including possibly killing his brother Fadric for being too popular with the nobility. But it also shows that Pedro faced genuine conspiracies constantly. His half-brothers were plotting against him. Nobles were in rebellion. His own wife's family was scheming. So was Pedro paranoid? Yes. Was he cruel? Also yes. Were people actually plotting against him constantly? Also yes. Everyone was correct in this situation, which is the worst kind of conspiracy. Pedro was eventually killed by his half-brother Enrique, who stabbed him personally after a period of civil war. Enrique then became king as Henry II and immediately started spreading propaganda about how terrible Pedro had been to justify his own usurpation. Let's talk about the Borgias again, but specifically about whether Lucretia Borgia was complicit in her family's crimes or a victim of them. Lucretia Borgia married 3 times, all marriages arranged by her father Pope Alexander VI and brother Cesare for political advantage. Her first marriage was annulled when the political situation changed. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was murdered by Cesare not allegedly, pretty much definitely. Her third marriage to Alfonso d'Este lasted, and by all accounts she became a capable Duchess of Ferrara. Rumors circulated throughout her life that she was as ruthless as her father and brother, that she poisoned her enemies, that she had an incestuous relationship with both of them, that she was essentially the brains behind Borgia schemes. Modern historians generally believe these accusations were exaggerated or false. Lucretia appears to have been used by her father and brother as a political pawn, married off repeatedly for alliances. The incest allegations were propaganda by Borgia enemies. The poisoning stories were probably false, but Lucretia did benefit from her family's position. She did hold power during her time in Ferrara. She wasn't a helpless victim. The reality is more complicated than either she was just as evil as they were, or she was an innocent pawn. The conspiracy theories about the Borgias included exaggerations about Lucretia that were false, but they were rooted in the very real crimes of her father and brother, which she couldn't have been entirely unaware of. Let's drift to talk about the Children's Crusade of 1212, because the conspiracy theories about what really happened to those children were horrifying, and modern historians think they were partly true. The traditional story is that thousands of children, inspired by religious fervor, marched toward the Holy Land to peacefully convert Muslims through the power of innocence. They never reached Jerusalem. Most supposedly died, turned back, or were sold into slavery. This story was dismissed by later historians as propaganda or myth. Children wouldn't actually do this. The medieval sources must be exaggerating or fabricating. Then historians looked more carefully at the sources and the social context. There really were popular movements in 1212 involving young people, though children may have meant adolescents and young adults, not toddlers. They really did march south, and they really did disappear. The conspiracy theory that emerged later was that these young crusaders were either deliberately led into slavery or opportunistically enslaved when they reached Mediterranean ports. Some sources suggest that merchants offered them free passage to the Holy Land and then sold them to slave markets in North Africa. Modern analysis suggests this probably did happen to some groups. Whether it was planned from the beginning or opportunistic remains unclear, but the Children's Crusade did end with many participants being sold into slavery. The conspiracy theory was true. The whole incident shows how religious fervor could be manipulated, how vulnerable people could be exploited, and how horrible things could happen with everyone involved thinking they were acting righteously. Now, let's talk about papal elections, because the conspiracy theories about them being corrupt were absolutely correct for long periods of medieval history. The papacy in the 10th and 11th centuries went through a period called the pornocracy, or rule of the harlots, which tells you something about how historians viewed it. Powerful Roman families, particularly noblewomen like Theodora and Marozia, essentially controlled who became pope. Marozia was a medieval Roman noblewoman who had affairs with one pope, Sergius III, mothered another pope, John XI, and allegedly murdered a third pope, John X. She was basically running the papacy as a family business for a period in the early 10th century. This sounds like anti-papal propaganda. It's actually documented history. Later, papal elections involved cardinals being bribed, threatened, or imprisoned until they voted the right way. The election of Alexander VI Rodrigo Borgian 1409 to continue 922 involved him literally handing bags of gold to cardinals to secure their votes. Everyone knew this happened. He wasn't even subtle about it. The conspiracy theory that papal elections were corrupt was not a theory. It was observable fact that even pro-papal sources acknowledge when discussing this period. The Church tried to reform papal elections multiple times, establishing rules about conclaves and bribery. These rules were regularly violated when inconvenient. The Protestant reformers would later use these examples as evidence that the entire Catholic Church was corrupt. And while they certainly exaggerated for propaganda purposes, the underlying facts they cited were often accurate. Let's talk about medieval universities and whether they were suppressing knowledge, because this gets complicated. Medieval universities were created and funded primarily by the Church. They preserved ancient learning, taught logic and philosophy, and trained scholars. This was genuinely valuable, but they also had strict controls on what could be taught and what conclusions could be reached. Anything that contradicted church doctrine was forbidden. Scholars who pushed boundaries too far could be condemned for heresy. Peter Abelard, a 12th century philosopher and theologian, kept getting into trouble for his views on the Trinity and other theological matters. He was brought before church councils multiple times, had his writings condemned and burned, and ended his career in a monastery under close supervision. Was Abelard being persecuted for pursuing truth? Or was he genuinely teaching things that contradicted Christian doctrine? Both, really. His work was intellectually sophisticated, but it did raise questions that made church authorities nervous. Roger Bacon, a 13th century friar and philosopher, advocated for empirical observation and experimentation. Later writers claimed he was persecuted by the Church for his scientific work. Modern historians have shown this was exaggerated. Bacon was imprisoned at one point, but probably for violations of his Franciscan vows rather than for his science. But Bacon did have to be very careful about how he presented his work. He had to frame everything within acceptable theological boundaries. So while he wasn't exactly suppressed, his work was constrained by what was theologically acceptable. The conspiracy theory that medieval universities suppressed knowledge is partially true. They preserved and taught a great deal, but within strict boundaries. Scholars who wanted to explore outside those boundaries had to be very careful or face consequences. Let us drift toward our conclusion by talking about medieval astrology and whether there was a conspiracy to use it for political manipulation. Because yes, absolutely there was. Medieval rulers employed court astrologers who would predict auspicious times for battles, marriages, and important decisions. The astrologers were expected to provide useful advice, which often meant telling the ruler what they wanted to hear while dressing it up in astronomical terminology. When critics accused court astrologers of being frauds who told rulers whatever would keep them employed, they were often correct. Some astrologers genuinely believed in their craft, but many were sophisticated enough to understand they were providing politically useful interpretations rather than objective truth. The conspiracy theory was that astrology was used to justify decisions that rulers wanted to make anyway, giving them cover to claim divine or cosmic sanction. This was true. Astrology was a tool of political legitimation as much as it was a system of belief. Catherine de' Medici, in the 16th century, famously employed astrologers and was accused of using occult practices to influence politics. While the accusations of witchcraft were exaggerated, she absolutely did consult astrologers before major decisions, and her reliance on them was a political tool as much as personal belief. Let us talk about the medieval climate and whether there was a conspiracy to hide crop failures and famines, because this touches on how information was controlled. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions across Europe. It was caused by catastrophic weather years of excessive rain that destroyed crops. Medieval people didn't understand climate science, so they looked for human causes. Conspiracy theories blamed everyone from Jews to lepers to corrupt officials for the famine. Some of these theories led to violence, but there was also a real conspiracy. Local and regional authorities absolutely did hide the extent of the crisis to prevent panic and to avoid looking incompetent. Records show that officials underreported deaths, downplayed crop failures, and restricted information about how bad things were. This wasn't a coordinated conspiracy across Europe, but multiple local conspiracies of silence that had similar effects. When people accused authorities of hiding the truth about how many were dying, they were often correct. The information control was real, even if the causes of the famine weren't sinister plots. Let us drift back to talk about one more royal conspiracy, the death of Edward II's father. Edward I, called Longshanks or Hammer of the Scots, died in 1307 during another campaign against Scotland. The official story was that he died of dysentery while marching north. His final wishes were supposedly that his bones be carried with the army until Scotland was conquered, which is very him. But his son Edward II ignored this and buried him normally. For years, there were whispers that Edward I had actually been poisoned by someone in his own camp who was tired of constant Scottish campaigns, or that he died of something more mysterious than dysentery. These were dismissed as baseless rumors. Modern analysis of Edward I's health in his final years suggests he had some kind of chronic illness, possibly related to his extreme height and the stress of constant military campaigns. His death was probably natural, not murder. But the interesting part is why the conspiracy theories emerged. Edward I had made so many enemies through his brutal Scottish and Welsh campaigns that many people wanted to believe he'd been murdered. The conspiracy theories said more about his unpopularity than about his actual death. Sometimes conspiracy theories emerge not because they're true, but because people want them to be true. Medieval people understood this. They spread stories that fit the narrative they wanted, regardless of evidence. Let's talk about medieval guilds and whether they were conspiring to control trade and prices. Because yes, absolutely, that was literally their purpose. Guilds were organizations of craftsmen and merchants that controlled who could practice a trade, set quality standards, and regulated prices. When outsiders accused guilds of being monopolistic conspiracies designed to keep prices high and exclude competition, guild members said they were maintaining quality and protecting their members. Both were true. Guilds did maintain quality standards. Guild-certified craftsmen generally produced reliable work, but they also absolutely restricted competition, kept prices higher than a free market would allow, and excluded people who could not afford the entry fees or who were unconnected to existing guild members. The conspiracy theory that guilds were anti-competitive monopolies was completely accurate. It just wasn't seen as a bad thing by the people benefiting from the system. Guilds would also coordinate to prevent labor organizing by journeymen and apprentices. If workers in one guild tried to demand better conditions, other guilds would refuse to employ them. This was a deliberate conspiracy across multiple organizations to suppress wages. So yes, there was a conspiracy. It was documented, it was legal, and it lasted for centuries until economic changes made the guild system unsustainable. Let us drift into our final topic, medieval maps, and whether there was a conspiracy to hide geographical knowledge. Medieval maps, particularly the famous Mappa Mundi style, showed Jerusalem at the center of the world, included mythical lands, and generally looked nothing like accurate geographical representations. For years, this was interpreted as medieval ignorance or religious dogma overwhelming practical knowledge. Then historians looked more carefully at who made these maps and for what purpose. The elaborate ceremonial maps were propaganda pieces designed to show theological and political relationships rather than accurate geography. Meanwhile, Portoline charts, practical navigation maps used by sailors, were much more accurate. So there wasn't exactly a conspiracy to hide geographical knowledge. There were different types of maps for different purposes. The showy ceremonial maps that put Jerusalem at the center weren't meant to be used for navigation. They were symbolic representations, but there were absolutely cases where geographical knowledge was restricted. Venice, in particular, tried to keep detailed knowledge of eastern trade routes secret to maintain their commercial advantage. Merchants who shared too much information about routes, ports, and trading conditions could face punishment. The conspiracy theory that geographical knowledge was being controlled and restricted was true, just not in the simplistic way often imagined. It wasn't ignorant suppression, it was calculated economic secrecy. And with that, let's let ourselves drift away from these medieval conspiracies, these whispered accusations that turned out to be true, these moments when paranoia was justified. Medieval people lived in a world where information was scarce, where power was concentrated, where secrecy was necessary for survival. They developed conspiracy theories because conspiracies were real. Nobles really were poisoning each other. Monks really were forging documents. Kings really were being murdered by their relatives. The church really was corrupt. Modern people sometimes mock medieval conspiracy theories as naive or superstitious, but medieval people understood power and deception quite well. They lived with it daily. So as you drift off to sleep, remember that history is full of conspiracies that turned out to be true. The paranoid weren't always wrong. The whispers sometimes contained truth, and the official story was often a carefully constructed lie. Sweet dreams. May your own conspiracies be limited to wondering whether your neighbor is stealing your newspaper, rather than whether they're plotting to have you declared a heretic and burned at the stake. Thank you for drifting through medieval history with me tonight. Until next time, sleep well.